I want to introduce Rick Wartzman. He's chief advisor at the Drucker Institute. Peter Drucker might be familiar to some of you, at least the economists, because he has a real thoughtful management theory. And Rick is one of these people who really try to implement the thoughtful things. That's why he's here. He wrote some books and recently works on a book how the relationship between employee and employer in the US will be redesigned in the future, and he looks how the development so far has been. So he will tell us something about the history of guaranteed wage and income. Please welcome Rick.
See if we can get the technology to cooperate. Let's see here. Very good. Great. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought this morning was just really stimulating. When the Silicon Valley venture capitalist Sam Altman spoke recently about the need for a basic income, he put it in these terms. I think the default belief of a child, he said, is that everyone should get food to eat, and it strikes most children as incredibly unfair if that's not the case. Well, it's with Altman's words ringing in my mind that I realize I'm now one of the few speakers between you and lunch, and so I will endeavor to go as quickly as I can here. I first began to focus on the idea of providing everyone with a basic income when I first heard Robin Chase of Zipcar fame speak last year at a management forum in Vienna. And she talked about UBI as a necessary balm against the inevitable large-scale job loss that many are sure to suffer as technology continues in its inexorable and exponential advance. I see what's happening, and the pace of it, she said, hordes of people will be left behind. Now, I must confess that as I heard Chase speak, I felt like I was listening to another pioneer from the world of autos, Walter Reuther, the legendary head of the United Auto Workers Union, who in the mid-1950s made a historic plea for a guaranteed annual wage in the United States. I've been researching Reuther's efforts as part of this book that I'm working on about the social contract between employer and employee in the United States and how that's changed since the end of World War II. And it's a story from which, despite its decidedly American Yankee context, I'm hopeful that we can draw at least a few useful lessons for today, more than half a century later. For those of you not familiar with him, Walter Reuther was arguably America's most important labor leader and one of the country's most important civil rights leaders for much of the 20th century. The son of a German immigrant union activist, Reuther was born in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1907. When he was just 11 years old, he went with his dad to visit his father's hero, who was then in prison in West Virginia, the 5-time socialist presidential candidate in the United States, Eugene Debs. This made a lasting impression on the young boy. Reuther moved to Detroit in 1927, where over the next few years he would show great skill as a die maker at Ford Motor Company, take economics and sociology classes at Detroit City College, and he would campaign for the Socialist Party. In January 1933, Reuther and his younger brother Victor then set off for Europe, and in turn they went on to Russia, hoping to learn more about the Soviet system. Taking jobs at the fledgling Gorky Auto Works, which is what you see in this photo, they were most impressed. In all the countries we have thus far been in, Victor Reuther told a friend, we have never found such a genuine proletarian democracy. In late 1935, the Reuthers returned to Detroit, where Walter rejoined the Socialist Party and began to make his mark as a United Auto Workers organizer. Most dramatically during the Flint sit-down strike at General Motors, where in early 1937 he led the occupation of Chevy Engine Plant Number 4, which was a linchpin of the GM factory system. Several months later, he took part in what's called the Battle of the Overpass at Ford, In that brawl, several company union busters kicked and punched Reuther and another UAW organizer, Richard Frankenstein, near the Miller Road overpass outside Ford's sprawling Rouge River plant. Reuther was then thrown down a flight of stairs, though, as you can see from this photo, it looks like Frankenstein, the guy on the right, actually got the worst of it. Reuther came away bloodied and battered, but proud and now clearly able to claim the high moral ground in the union's tussle against corporate America. As deft as Reuther was at fighting the big companies, he demonstrated equal aptitude for dispatching his foes inside the union. At first, Reuther allied himself with the union's more radical faction, which included a group of communists. In part, this was a way for him to differentiate himself from rivals who favored a more accommodationist policy with General Motors. And later on, when it suited his ambitions, he turned against the communists and resigned from the Socialist Party as well. By 1940, Reuther had emerged as a national spokesman for the pro-defense, pro-Roosevelt wing of the American labor movement, a standing that Reuther cemented with a bold plan known as 500 planes a day to speed the auto industry's conversion to military output. After the war, Reuther became president of the auto workers, and the union pressed hard for getting a piece of the expanding wealth of the big car companies, which were profiting handsomely amid a booming consumer economy. This all culminated in the union's landmark agreement with General Motors, widely known as the Treaty of Detroit, and that's them shaking hands over the Treaty of Detroit, which solidified workers' protection against inflation through a cost of living adjustment, while lifting their hourly wages and providing improved health care benefits, and for the first time offering pensions for retirement. All told, the contract in 1950 guaranteed GM's factory hands a 20% increase in their standard of living by 1955. The Treaty of Detroit wasn't just important for the auto workers. It symbolized an era in which America's working class more generally had come to share in the heady gains of the nation's largest businesses, which, with relatively little global competition to worry about, at least for the moment, were enjoying a genuinely golden age. 50 years ago, the editors of Fortune magazine wrote in 1951, American capitalism seemed what Marx predicted it would be, the inhuman offspring of greed and irresponsibility. But now the magazine said, U.S. capitalism is popular capitalism, not only in the sense that it has popular support, but in the deeper sense that the people as a whole participate in it. And yet Reuther was concerned. Beneath all this glittering prosperity, he could sense some dangerous fault lines forming. Among his biggest worries was the one that Robin Chase and so many others we heard from this morning worry about today, what technology and automation would mean for jobs. Cognizant that he couldn't afford to be seen as a Luddite, Reuther went out of his way to praise the manifold benefits brought by machines. You can't stop technological progress, he said, and it would be silly to try if you could. But then in his very next breath, Reuther would condemn business for not doing enough to temper automation's ill effects. More and more, he asserted, we are witnessing the often frightening results of the widespread introduction of increasingly efficient methods of production without the leavening influence of moral or social responsibility. On the ground, among the rank and file, the same fears were growing. In 1953, Alfred Granakis, the president of Union Local 1250, told Reuther that he had been wrestling with himself for weeks on end over Ford's new Brook Park, Ohio engine factory and foundry, supposedly the most highly automated facility that the industry had seen at that point. Granakis had negotiated the local contract governing the Brook Park plant, photo of which is seen here, and he feared that he hadn't sufficiently dealt with the consequences of what its myriad automated processes would mean for those on the shop floor. I'm greatly afraid of embracing an economic Frankenstein that I helped to create in its infancy, he told Reuther. Even in the 1950s, it wasn't hard to imagine a world where machines would replace most people's jobs. Then again, having a vivid imagination didn't hurt either. Kurt Vonnegut tapped his imagination to write his first novel, Player Piano, published in 1952. In it, he renders a future society that is run by machines. There's no more need at all for human labor. Early on in the book, the main character, an engineer named Paul Proteus, is chatting with his secretary, Catherine. "Do you suppose there'll be a third industrial revolution?" Paul paused in his office doorway. "A third one? What would that be like?" Catherine rattled a pencil between her teeth. "First the muscle work, then the routine work, then maybe the real brain work. I hope I'm not around long enough to see that final step," Paul said. As Reuther entered contract talks in 1955, the union's first since the Treaty of Detroit, he'd made up his mind. He would insist on a program to cushion the blow to workers idled because of automation. This was the guaranteed annual wage, or GAW, soon to be widely discussed and debated across the country by pundits and politicians, by business executives, and lunch-pail working folks alike. As proposed by the auto workers, the GAW would make it so that once an hourly worker had achieved seniority, something usually reached after 90 days of probation at the auto companies, he or she would begin to build up protection against future layoffs. By the time an employee had 2 years of seniority, he or she would have banked 52 weeks of guaranteed income, and I quote, "in amounts sufficient to maintain the same living standards as when fully employed." It's important to recognize that the GAW was not an issue confined just to the car companies. Reuther's vision extended far beyond the auto industry, which, by the way, was the biggest employer in America at the time, to all of industrial labor. Indeed, he viewed the GAW campaign as economic policy making on the grand scale, Nelson Lichtenstein, Reuther's biographer, has written. Nor was this mere posturing on Reuther's part. The gains won by the auto workers and other major unions like the auto workers and the steel workers, both of which were also pushing for a guaranteed wage, tended to create ripples across the entire economy among unionized and non-union companies alike. Reuther's guaranteed wage was big news, catapulting him to the cover of Time magazine. The headline on the story inside read, "The GAW Man." Reuther's goals with the GAW went beyond simply making sure that his members had financial security, though that was no small piece of it. Another aspect of what he was after was to goad employers concerned that under a GAW they'd be shouldering too much of the burden for those who'd been laid off. He wanted them to press the government to do more. The GAW, in other words, was designed to be a backdoor inducement to expand the welfare state in America. And some saw clear logic in this strategy. Actually, Life magazine noted, "The GAW plan is nothing more than a form of insurance. If that is to be provided, there is a good case for spreading the risk and the cost as widely as possible." At the same time, Reuther also insisted that what he hoped the GAW would do was get the automakers and other companies to plan well enough, anticipating the ebb and flow of their production cycles, that they could smooth out everyone's employment. The ideal guaranteed annual wage, said Reuther, would be one that never resulted in payment to any worker for time spent in idleness, because the workers covered are kept steadily employed. To show that this thinking wasn't pie in the sky, the union cited companies that historically had guaranteed work to its employees even during slack times. The consumer products manufacturer Procter & Gamble, for instance, meatpacker Hormel, and shoemaker Nunn Bush. The earliest such plans went all the way back to the 1890s. Yet at General Motors, not only was there no such policy, but individuals found themselves sidelined from work whenever there was a model change, new model of car coming in. Even during the go-go years of the 1950s, seasonality alone could translate into temporary layoffs for as many as 160,000 workers between March and August. GM has never faced up to one responsibility to our people in connection with these production fluctuations, conceded Vern Lassault, an employee relations official at the company. Nevertheless, most of those running GM and their counterparts across American industry had nothing but disdain for the guaranteed wage. In some cases, today's critics of UBI are simply echoing those voices from 60 years ago. If we allow ourselves to accede to the principle of jobless pay, there's no telling how far such a thing would go in tearing down the spirit of working for a living, said Donaldson Brown, a GM director. Some went further. The Michigan Manufacturers Association called the GAW, and I realize I'm standing on European soil as I say this, the manufacturers called it a fanatic, dishonest, un-American, foreign, socialistic nightmare. Even Peter Drucker, seen here, who advocated a quote-unquote predictable income plan to alleviate the dread of the unknown and the deep feelings of insecurity under which the worker lives, thought that the GAW went too far. The guaranteed annual income of union rhetoric, he wrote, is as empty a promise as one of immortality would be. Quipped John Bugis, the head of industrial relations at Ford, we'd be very happy if only someone would come up with a good plan for GAP, or guaranteed annual profits. In the end, the opposition was simply too great for Reuther to overcome. Still, 1955 was a very good year in America. Fittingly, the 50th millionth car that General Motors ever produced was a 55 model Chevrolet, and Reuther was not about to go away empty-handed. What he was able to wring out, first at Ford and then at GM, was a version of the GAW. But it was so diminished that it went by an altogether different name, Supplemental Unemployment Benefits, or SUB. With SUB, the companies agreed to contribute 5 cents for every hour a person worked into a trust fund that could be accessed in case of layoff for up to 26 weeks. Combined with state benefits, it was enough of a buffer for a worker to receive 60 to 65% of his or her regular pay for as much as half a year. As was typical whenever GM or Ford did something, other companies followed along and adopted SUBs as well. Among them were Chrysler and several smaller automakers, Continental Can and American Can, the maritime shipping industry, and by 1956, Big Steel. Even so, the SUB would ultimately protect only 2% or so of the American workforce. Despite the SUB's limited reach, a number of business groups protested what Ford and GM had done. The president of the National Association of Manufacturers suggested that any vestige of the guaranteed wage could, quote, have seriously damaging effects on the American economy. The National Economic Council, a conservative group, said Reuther's Gawful, or GAW full, fraud was uneconomic and can spell only disaster for the worker, for business, and for the nation. At GM, meanwhile, executives struggled to make sense of what all the excitement was about. In their eyes, it wasn't like they had given in to Reuther's original demand for a full-blown guaranteed wage. Anybody who draws any conclusions that Ford, General Motors, or others have met the demands for a guaranteed annual wage simply can't read English correctly, said Alfred Sloan, GM's chairman, who's shown here. For GM, the cost of the deal was in fact quite minimal, considering what it offered in return. 3 more years of industrial peace, effectively extending the Treaty of Detroit to at least 1958. So, what are we to make of this fight over the guaranteed wage? Even though this was a battle over the size and shape of a private sector safety net, and was in this way prototypically American in character, I think that there are at least 3 overarching lessons to be learned from this chapter of history. First, the most effective way to articulate the need for a basic income is not with a single line of reasoning, but with multiple arguments. To be sure, Walter Reuther always framed the GAW in moral terms. He said, in fact, it would end the immoral double standard under which the worker, of all those who draw their incomes from industry, has the least protection against economic adversity. But Reuther also made a cogent case on economic grounds. The GAW was an imperative, he explained, so that consumers can have a sustained income, month in and month out, he said, because only on that basis can we sustain an economy of full employment and full production and full distribution. I think that at least in the United States, this particular idea may have real resonance now. Companies today are beginning to wake up to the fact that the consumer economy needs more fuel, and a basic income could help provide that. Over the past couple of years, according to the Center for American Progress, nearly 70% of the top 100 U.S. retailers have cited falling or flat incomes among consumers as a basic risk to their business in their federal financial filings. That's double the number of companies that sounded such an alarm a decade ago. Increased inequality contributes to insufficient aggregate demand, too little spending by consumers and businesses to keep GDP at its capacity, the Harvard economist and former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers has warned. The second lesson that I take away is be prepared to bend. I don't consider myself an expert on basic income, and I really came here to learn. But I understand that some advocates are open to certain compromises, turning UBI into a participation income, for example, in which everyone who receives money would have to take part in some kind of economic activity, be it volunteer work or training. Others are willing to have UBI apply to households as opposed to individuals. Yet others may be less flexible on these and other points, including the size of a basic income. I think that Reuther, who in the final analysis was as much a pragmatist as an idealist, would find that a mistake. You never get everything, he remarked in 1955, as a guaranteed wage gave way to supplemental unemployment benefits. And lastly, there's this. Even partial victories can take many, many years to achieve. The journey is hard and long. Reuther began pushing for a guaranteed wage in 1947. It would be 8 years until he could bring the issue to the bargaining table in earnest. Reuther and the UAW would press the matter again in 1967, with the union renewing its call for a full-scale GAW as a top bargaining issue. After a lengthy strike at Ford, the union again fell short, but it also made gains and was able to raise supplemental unemployment benefits to 95% of pay for a full year for its members. And in the 1980s, amid a flurry of job cuts among car makers, the union was able to add another layer of protection called a guaranteed income stream, which provided workers with 50% to 75% of take-home pay until they were 62 years old. Walter Reuther died in 1970, tragically, in a plane crash. He himself was 62 at the time. And I think he left behind much for us to think about. We believe that free men, free labor, free management, working together with free government in a free economic system, have the glorious opportunity of cooperating in the creating and the sharing of economic abundance, he declared. We believe that this is the first time in the history of human civilization that we can solve man's economic and material needs, food and clothing, and we can facilitate the growth of every human being, as a social being, as a cultural being, as a spiritual being. I'm sure that Walter Reuther would be pleased to see that so many of you are keeping up the good fight. Thank you very much.
Are you open for questions?
Yeah, sure.
We have another few seconds for questions.
Well, thank you very much for that historical view. But, of course, there is criticism of everything he did. And I believe that criticism is similar to the criticism now facing the universal basic income. Being on the one side, the whole universality of it, you have to have it everywhere. So one of the criticisms against the union movement was it created a privileged class of worker on the one side, and everybody that was not in Detroit at the time lost out because it favored the people in the system contrary to these people outside the system. And the second one is you have to have the same system everywhere. As we know, Detroit is now bankrupt, and General Motors just recently went bankrupt. The criticism being that they had competition from Japan and South Carolina, even in the same system, because people moved out because the wages were too high in Detroit, and thus made them less competitive. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, a lot there. One, I think this idea of universality is important in the way you say, and may ultimately make things more appealing if that case can be articulated. I think this idea that I mentioned of a participation income or some kind of way that people actually need to participate is also hugely important in many people's minds, and goes to some of the kind of cynics and skeptics, right, that Rob Johnson talked about this morning, of people who feel like, well, this is just handing people money for doing nothing. And whether that is volunteer work or national service or community service or maybe even taking care of a loved one at home who needs care, that there may need to be something in that vein. And the auto workers have run into that when, in their jobs bank program, another economic security program, it was found that people were essentially being paid to do nothing and sit in a so-called rubber room all day and play checkers and watch cartoons. That did not go down well, and I think there's a deep resistance to that needs to be overcome, and maybe with some kind of service or some kind of economic participation. The last thing I would say is I think America is really caught between these two things, which is we have the vestiges of this old private welfare state of which this was part, and you rightly point out, not only has Detroit crumbled in so many ways, but this private safety net has eroded over the last 40 years tremendously, right? Job security is gone. Average worker pay has stagnated. Healthcare benefits, more people are paying more out of pocket. Obamacare has helped, reverse some of that, but hasn't fixed it totally. Pensions are, really have gone way down in terms of people's retirement security. So we're clinging to this old system, but at least, from what I can tell, Americans are also resistant to expanding the state safety net at the same time. And so we're kind of in the worst of both worlds right now. Maybe a smart, universal, basic income plan can at least help push in the right direction.